Hey everyone, welcome to Apocalypse Here, Christianity You Can Live With. Thank you all for tuning in to our recent interview / conversation with Mark Gaiman and Doug Campbell on Christian anti-Semitism. Two guys we've had on before, two people who have been really important for my theological and scriptural formation. So it was great to have those two in dialogue about that topic. And if you haven't checked out that video, it is on the channel and it's definitely well worth your time. So today we are going to be talking about Eric Metaxas's book, Bonhoeffer, Pastor, Prophet, Martyr, Spy, a Righteous Gentile versus the Third Reich. Now, as you know, this book is quite popular. It's been quite popular since it was released about 11 years ago, almost 11 years ago. And a lot has been said and written about Metaxas's book since its release. The book has received accolades from many conservative evangelicals. Metaxas is a good writer. As the depiction of Bonhoeffer's life coheres with many of the things that evangelicals hold dear. And there certainly is space for a popular level treatment of Bonhoeffer's life from an evangelical perspective, one that looks closely at the historical context and the writings of Bonhoeffer himself. Unfortunately, that's not what we get with Metaxas's book. You've probably noticed that Metaxas has pretty much remained in the news, not just for sucker punching a guy on a bike and the wild stuff that he says on Twitter. He has the sort of broader unconditional support of Donald Trump. He regularly uses his understanding of Bonhoeffer's legacy as a sort of justification for throwing his weight behind Trump. As Stephen Haynes notes in his book, The Battle for Bonhoeffer, which you should all check out, Bonhoeffer has become, in sort of popular American imagination, something of a blank canvas onto which people can sort of create their own picture of who he really was, and then use that for ideological purposes. Okay? The Bonhoeffer we find on the pages of Metaxas's book is basically a good old Bible-reading, Bible-believing Christian who can and is weaponized in today's cultural battles. Metaxas's self-described Bonhoeffer moment, as a sort of call to arms for conservative evangelicals to resist the perceived evils of the left, is supposedly drawn from his reconstruction of Bonhoeffer's life and work. He's given plenty of interviews to suggest that. But how accurate is his depiction of Bonhoeffer? Some of you may have only been introduced to Bonhoeffer through Metaxas's bestseller. Indeed, it is a bestseller. It's been in the hands of a lot of people. Possibly you haven't read any Bonhoeffer texts themselves, or perhaps you may have read Metaxas's book and then some of Bonhoeffer, and maybe realize that things don't quite line up. I don't know. Regardless, I hope that this video can show, drawing on reviews of Metaxas's work by some Bonhoeffer scholars, what Metaxas presents is a limited and sometimes dishonest Bonhoeffer by an evangelical for evangelicals. Now, part of the issue, as I note in the second point, is that Metaxas is just in over his head. Bonhoeffer was an incredibly sophisticated and subtle thinker whose writings, though rather few in number compared to some others of his time, have been read and debated for many years by Bonhoeffer scholars trained in early 20th century German philosophy and theology. I mean, I've read and studied Kierkegaard, Heidegger, Bultmann, Barth, and many other theologians and philosophers who informed Bonhoeffer's thought. And Bonhoeffer is still incredibly difficult to grasp for me. Metaxas's narration makes things seem neat and tidy. Like I said, Metaxas is a pretty compelling writer. He depends a lot on Eberhard Bethge's classic biography, as well as the Dietrich Bonhoeffer works in English edition. But Metaxas does not have the philosophical, theological, and historical tools necessary to provide an accurate picture of Bonhoeffer. And I'm not the only one who thinks this. As Bonhoeffer scholar Victoria Barnett has written, Metaxas, quote, has a very shaky grasp of the political, theological, and ecumenical history of the period. He has pieced together the historical and theological backdrop for the Bonhoeffer story using examples from various works, sometimes completely out of context and often without understanding their meaning, end quote. And as another Bonhoeffer scholar who edited part of the Dietrich Bonhoeffer works in English and who has written extensively on Bonhoeffer, Clifford Green, notes, quote, there is no new research in this biography, end quote. He further writes, quote, and given the tendency of evangelicals and liberals to focus on parts of Bonhoeffer's theology and witness, The challenge is to transcend theological polarization and present an integrated and compelling picture, end quote. But this is exactly what we do not get in Metaxas's work. Polarization, as I suggest here, polarization is exactly what structures his work. He sets out to reclaim Bonhoeffer from the liberals, who he believes have hijacked Bonhoeffer in his interpretation. And some major problems flow from this polarizing agenda, as I will walk through now. So, over-determining the pious Bonhoeffer, Metaxas claims wrongly that, quote, from the beginning of his time until the end, Bonhoeffer maintained the daily discipline of scriptural meditation and prayer he had been practicing for more than a decade. Once he got his Bible back, he read it for hours each day, end quote. This is a nice kind of rosy picture that I'm sure many pious people can get behind, but this is just false. In 1944, Bonhoeffer wrote to his friend Eberhard Bethge, quote, once again, I am having weeks when I don't read the Bible much, end quote. And Bonhoeffer had told Bethge the same thing a couple times in 1941 and 1942. So there's sort of an initial overdetermining of Bonhoeffer's piety that would be in line with sort of modern evangelicalism. Misconstruing Bonhoeffer's time in the United States. So Metaxas' treatment of Bonhoeffer's year at Union Theological Seminary in 1930 to 31 is even more problematic than the mistake about Bonhoeffer's devotional life. It's true that Bonhoeffer was quite critical of the theology being discussed at Union, yeah, for sure, as well as the preaching that he heard at Riverside Church. But Metaxas goes so far as to suggest that it wasn't until his experience at Abyssinian Baptist Church that he really became a serious Christian. However, Clifford Green, Bonhoeffer scholar that I mentioned, has made the case in the 10th volume of the Bonhoeffer works that the Abyssinian Church certainly impacted his life, but in a way that complemented rather than overturned the impact of Bonhoeffer's friends at Union, and they were his friends. As Green writes, quote, at Union, as Bonhoeffer himself reports, he engaged in life-changing discussions with his colleagues. Discussions about the Sermon on the Mount, peace, and learning to have faith. These led directly and quickly to the work of his book, Discipleship. There, too, he got to know several social gospel radicals, pacifists, and socialists, about whom he continued to inquire in letters years later, end quote. Metaxas doesn't tell us anything about this reality. He depicts Union as this other that Bonhoeffer is rejecting wholesale. Why does he do this? Because his Union seminary is a construct of his polarizing worldview in which evangelicals are pitted against liberals. So he's fitting it into his already preconceived understandings of the church. Now, a lack of understanding of Bonhoeffer's context. Metaxas doesn't really show much knowledge of it in any sort of in-depth way. It's a little hard to take him seriously when he clearly thinks Bonn is in Switzerland, which it's not, it's in Germany, and that Hitler was democratically elected into office, or that Germany wasn't an actual police state until August 1934. He also claims that the Barmen Declarations, the doctrinal statement of the confessing church and the rejection of the Third Reich, quote, repudiated anti-Semitism. Repudiated anti-Semitism. That's coming from page 222 of his book, Repudiated Anti-Semitism. The declaration makes no mention of anti-Semitism, and this is why it's been criticized many, many times afterward by many theologians. It's for exactly that reason. It doesn't have anti-Semitism as a reason for rejecting the Third Reich. Metaxas also doesn't seem to understand German theology very well. His bibliography contains no works on German theology, except for those about Bonhoeffer, and even many important works on Bonhoeffer's thought are missing. Metaxas correctly identifies Karl Barth as Bonhoeffer's most important influence, but he never explains anything about Barth's theology, except that Barth opposed liberal theology at the time. He doesn't seem to get, though, that Barth's rejection of liberalism in that context did not make him an inerrantist. Barth was not an inerrantist, and he explicitly is not one. Metaxas depicts the confessing church, in general, as Green says, quote, as if it were an American denomination founded by Bonhoeffer. Indeed, he describes the battles of American fundamentalists and of the confessing church as essentially the same. Bonhoeffer, Metaxas tells us, quote, equated the fundamentalists with the confessing church. Here they were fighting against corrupting influences of the theologians at Union and Riverside. At home, the fight was against the Reich Church. So that's from page 334 of Metaxas's book. So for him, they're kind of the same battle, which doesn't make any sense. As I've said, given the complicated relationship Bonhoeffer had with people at Union, they weren't all bad. He rejected some of the theology, but he also made great friends and learned from them, especially the social gospelers and some of the quote-unquote liberal theologians there. He also gives a kind of silly account of the difference between Barth and Adolf von Harnack by kind of comparing it to the difference between Darwinian evolution and advocates of intelligent design. Metaxas also overlooks some of Bonhoeffer's radical, even unorthodox theological claims during the time, which were not at all outlandish in the relation to German theology in that context. You kind of have to know German theology to get this. Bonhoeffer said in his Christological lectures in 1933, where he claimed, quote, "The biblical witness is uncertain with regard to the virgin birth," end quote. And then in a footnote in Cost of Discipleship, he warns against viewing statements about Christ's resurrection as ontological statements. That is, statements about something that happened in real space and time. Yikes. I don't agree with that, but Bonhoeffer warned against that. Bonhoeffer also rejected the whole enterprise of apologetics, which he thought was fundamentally misguided. None of these things appear in Metaxas's work. None of these things, which would complicate his picture. Metaxas also essentially reduces the problem with the German church supporting Hitler, as Victoria Barnett writes, to, quote, formalistic, legalistic Lutherans who just needed to form a personal relationship with Jesus, end quote. The actual problem was that Germany was filled with Christians whose understanding of their faith had so converged with German national culture that it tainted both their politics and their theology. Many, many devout, well-educated, Bible-reading Christians and scholars in Germany fully supported National Socialism. It wasn't like a bunch of legalists were doing that. Bonhoeffer's theology, precisely because it was a theology of a devout, reflective, and faithful Christian, was far more complex than the narrow ideological confines to which Metaxas tries to restrict him. And because of this, Metaxas doesn't seem to be able to fit two crucial aspects of Bonhoeffer into his biography. He insists that Bonhoeffer was not a pacifist. While pacifism, as usually understood today, is not a good word to describe Bonhoeffer's position, his Christian peace ethic was rooted in the core doctrines of his theology, his Christology, his understanding of discipleship, his interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount, and his doctrine of the church. Even while the content of Bonhoeffer's pacifism continues to be the subject of debate among Bonhoeffer scholars, it is clear that Bonhoeffer did not abandon his peace ethic, even while working to kill Hitler and end the Nazi regime. It's all very, very complex. Metaxas also fails, so this is the second thing, he also fails to adequately treat Bonhoeffer's letters and papers from prison concerning, quote-unquote, religionless Christianity. As Green writes, in a Trinity Forum interview, Metaxas even stated that Bonhoeffer, quote, never really said it, but then had to retract it because Bonhoeffer did say it. But Metaxas continues, he wrote it in a private letter to Bethge and never intended anyone to see it because it was, quote, utterly out of keeping with the rest of Bonhoeffer's life. He calls Bonhoeffer's theological reflections a, quote, few bone fragments set upon by famished kites and less noble birds, many of whose descendants gnaw them still, end quote. But in dismissing, which is what he's doing, dismissing Bonhoeffer's prison theology, Metaxas overlooks Bonhoeffer's answer when Bethge asked him about the book that he was writing on religionless Christianity while in prison and how it was related to his unfinished ethics. Bonhoeffer answered that the book he was writing in prison was, quote, in a certain sense, a prologue to the larger ethics, and in part anticipates it, end quote. So against Metaxas, ethics and the prison theology belong together. We have to make sense of the prison stuff and not just dismiss it, which is essentially what he does. So why doesn't Metaxas incorporate this material? Because it simply cannot be forced into a conservative evangelical mold, nor a liberal one either, to be clear. Now, Bonhoeffer's central concerns remained the life of Christian faith in the world, yet his understanding of Christianity in its inherited forms had been shaken and altered and disrupted by the failures of the German church under Nazism. In 1942, Bonhoeffer wrote of, quote, a Christendom enmeshed in guilt beyond all measure, end quote. And this seems to be the starting point we need to grasp what he's doing in his discussions of religionless Christianity. As Barnett writes, quote, a thoughtful and honest evangelical analysis of the complete Bonhoeffer, not just parts that go down easy, would be useful. Metaxas has simply pulled together passages he likes within his prior categories and ignored anything that might complicate the picture he wants to create. The same thing of which he accuses others, as Metaxas writes on page 466. Many outre theological fashions have subsequently tried to claim Bonhoeffer as their own and have ignored much of his oeuvre to do so. They, i.e. the liberals, have made of these few skeletal fragments something like a theological Piltdown man, a jerry-built but sincerely believed hoax, end quote. Yeah, and I wish Metaxas would have taken his own advice. This book is, in the words of my friend Kara Slade, more like Bonhoeffer LARPing, live-action role-playing, than it is a work in historical biography. We really just end up with a martyr that Metaxas and others can use for their own political purposes. Bonhoeffer ends up looking like Eric Metaxas. Now, there are great Bonhoeffer bibliographies out there, 3 of which I've got here. The classic Eberhard Bethge, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. The more recent, actually published in the same year that Metaxas published his, Ferdinand Schlingensiepen, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, 1906 to 1944, 45, Martyr, Thinker, Man of Resistance, and then Charles Marsh's Strange Glory, A Life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So check those out. These are much more clearly historical investigations that don't have some sort of agenda to use Bonhoeffer for sort of political reasons and sort of use him as a political weapon, really, and a political justification. So I hope this was helpful for those of you who have read Metaxas's work. I'm actually not saying don't read it. What I am saying is if you are going to read it, make sure you're also picking up Bonhoeffer's works and reading those as well to see if this stuff is actually lining up with what Bonhoeffer says about things, and also read it against some of these other biographies, which are very well researched. Look into this for yourself. You don't have to agree with me. This is where I think Metaxas actually introduces a lot of problems into his reconstruction of Bonhoeffer. So thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. And with that, this has been Apocalypse here. Christianity you can live with.